Frozen injured German Shepherd begs man to enter the house. Then something unbelievable happens. The wind howled outside the cabin, rattling the windows and sending waves of snow across the frozen earth. Jack sat in his worn armchair, staring at the flickering flames of the fireplace, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. Solitude had become his closest companion, and he welcomed it. Out here, deep in the wilderness, the past remained buried beneath the snow and silence. He had chosen this life, chosen to disappear from a world that had disappointed him one too many times. But as he reached for his mug of coffee, a faint sound broke through the storm, a desperate scratching at the door. His muscles tensed. He set the mug down slowly, listening, waiting. Then it came again, more frantic this time, followed by a low, pitiful whimper. Jack stood, his breath steady but his heart pounding a little harder than it should. He wasn't a man who frightened easily, but out here, an unexpected visitor in the middle of a blizzard was never a good sign. Grabbing the old hunting knife from the table, he stepped toward the door and pressed his ear against the wood. The wind screeched, nearly drowning out the soft sound of breathing. Not human, an animal. He took a slow breath before unlocking the bolt and pulling the door open just enough to peek outside. A figure slumped against the threshold, barely visible beneath a layer of snow. A dog. No, not just any dog. A German Shepherd, its fur matted with dirt and streaked with blood. Its chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, its ribs faintly visible beneath the thick coat. One amber eye cracked open, locking onto Jack's with a look so raw, so desperate, that it made something shift deep within him. The dog let out a weak whimper, its head drooping as if acknowledging its own helplessness. Jack exhaled sharply. He should close the door, let nature take its course. He didn't take in strays, didn't involve himself in things that weren't his concern. But something about the way the animal had come here, the way it had fought through the storm just to reach this spot, it gnawed at him. With a muttered curse, he knelt, sliding an arm beneath the dog's limp body and lifting it carefully. The animal barely reacted, too exhausted to protest. Jack carried it inside, kicking the door shut behind him. The heat from the fireplace washed over them as he set the dog down near the hearth. Up close, he could see the extent of its injuries. Deep gashes ran along its side, one ear was torn, and there was dried blood crusted around its muzzle. Jack retrieved a blanket from the couch, draping it over the trembling body before disappearing into the kitchen. He returned with a bowl of warm water and an old rag, kneeling beside the dog and beginning the slow process of cleaning its wounds. The animal flinched at the touch but made no move to resist, its body too weak to fight back. Jack worked in silence, his mind turning over questions he had no answers for. Where had it come from? Had someone done this to it, or had it barely survived an encounter with another animal? And why, of all places, had it come here? As he wiped away the blood, he noticed something strange. A faint mark near its ear, partially hidden beneath the fur. Tattoo. A registration code. Not a stray then. A trained dog. Military, most likely. That changed things. Jack sat back, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. He had spent enough time around men who worked with dogs like this to recognize one when he saw it. This was no pet. This was an animal that had been trained, disciplined, and, if the state of it was any indication, discarded when it was no longer useful. A flicker of something close to anger stirred in Jack's chest. He had seen men like that before, the kind who used and abandoned, who left behind broken things without a second thought. The dog stirred slightly, its head lifting just an inch before dropping back onto the blanket. Jack sighed. "You made it here for a reason, didn't you?" he murmured, not expecting a response. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the damp fur between its ears. The dog tensed for a moment, then, as if deciding he wasn't a threat, relaxed beneath his touch. Jack let out a quiet breath, staring at the animal's battered form. He wasn't a man prone to sentiment, but something about this situation felt different. He had spent so long keeping the world at arm's length, telling himself he didn't need anyone or anything. But now, in his cabin, lying half dead by his fireplace, was a creature that had fought through a storm to get to him. Jack stood, stretching his sore knees, and moved to the kitchen. He rummaged through his supplies, eventually finding a can of leftover stew. It wasn't much, but it was warm. He filled a small bowl and set it down near the dog's nose, watching as it sniffed weakly. It took a few hesitant licks before exhaustion won, and it rested its head again. Not much of an appetite yet. That wasn't surprising. Jack settled back into his chair, staring at the flames. He had planned for another quiet night, another evening spent in the company of nothing but his own thoughts. Now he had an unexpected guest, one who carried more than just the weight of its own survival. Something told him this dog had a story, and whether he wanted to or not, Jack had just become a part of it. Outside, the wind howled, battering against the cabin as the snow continued to fall. But inside, for the first time in a long while, Jack wasn't alone. The storm had lessened by morning, but the cold still lingered, seeping through the wooden walls of the cabin. Jack awoke to the soft crackling of dying embers, the once roaring fire now reduced to smoldering coals. The first thing he noticed was the stillness, the kind that came after a night of unrest. Then he heard it, a faint rustling from the corner of the room. He turned his head and found the dog shifting slightly beneath the blanket, its breathing no longer as shallow, though still labored. The animal was alive, but its battle was far from over. Jack sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes before stretching his arms over his head. The stiffness in his shoulders was a familiar ache, one that came from years of hard living. He had seen wounds before on men, on animals. Some healed with time, others left scars too deep to fade. He had a feeling this dog carried more than just the ones on its skin. Jack stood, padding barefoot into the kitchen where he poured water into a dented kettle and set it over the stove. The air in the cabin was crisp, and he exhaled slowly, watching his breath cloud in the dim morning light. As the water heated, he grabbed a can of stew from the shelf, pried it open with a pocket knife, and poured a small portion into a tin bowl. He carried it over to the dog, crouching down beside it. "Eat," he said simply, pushing the bowl closer. The German Shepherd's ears twitched, but it didn't immediately move. A moment passed, then another, before it turned its head toward the food, sniffing cautiously. Jack waited, watching as the animal finally took a hesitant bite, then another. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell him that the dog still had some fight left in it. "That's it," he muttered, more to himself than the dog. As the kettle whistled, Jack stood, pouring himself a cup of black coffee. He took a slow sip, his mind turning over what he knew. The tattoo near the dog's ear confirmed what he had suspected. This wasn't just some lost mutt. It had been trained, disciplined, and judging by the state of it, abandoned. Jack had spent years around men who worked in shadows, men who saw animals like this as nothing more than tools, useful until they weren't. He had seen it before, the way they discarded them, like broken weapons tossed aside after battle. He felt the weight of that knowledge settle in his chest. The dog finished eating and rested its head on its paws. Jack studied it, noting the way it was finally beginning to relax, if only slightly. He grabbed a damp cloth from the table and knelt beside it once more, dabbing gently at the dried blood around its wounds. The dog stiffened but didn't lash out. Good. Still didn't trust him, but it didn't see him as a threat either. That was something. "You're a tough bastard," Jack muttered, shaking his head as he cleaned a deep gash along its side. The injury wasn't fresh, but it had been left untreated for too long. Infection was a risk, and he'd have to do something about that. The morning passed in silence, broken only by the occasional pop of the fire and the slow, steady breathing of the dog. Jack worked on patching up what wounds he could, using supplies from an old first aid kit he kept stashed away for emergencies. The dog tolerated it, though its eyes never left him, watching his every move with a wary intelligence that told Jack this animal had been through more than most. By the time he was done, the worst of the bleeding had been managed, and he sat back on his heels, studying his work. "You'll live," he said. Though whether that was a promise or an observation, he wasn't sure. Jack leaned against the wall, his gaze drifting to the window. The snow outside stretched endlessly, untouched except for the wind's constant rearranging. No tracks, no signs of anyone looking for the dog. Whoever had left it for dead either didn't care enough to come back or had assumed nature would finish the job. Jack wasn't sure which possibility angered him more. He wasn't the type to get involved, wasn't the type to let things like this sit heavy on his mind. But there was something about this dog, about the way it had fought to survive, that made it impossible to ignore. By midday, the German Shepherd was sitting up, though it still looked exhausted. Jack tossed another log into the fire and sat across from it, studying the way its ears flicked at every small sound. Hyper-aware, still on edge. Whatever had happened to it hadn't left its mind, and Jack knew from experience that some ghosts never did. He reached for the empty bowl and refilled it with more stew, setting it down once again. The dog hesitated only for a moment before eating. Better. Jack rubbed a hand over his face, sighing through his nose. He should figure out what to do next. Keeping the dog wasn't part of the plan. He lived out here for a reason, to be alone, away from the noise of the world. But as he watched the animal in front of him, something told him that sending it back out there wasn't an option either. "Not yet. Guess you're stuck with me for now," he muttered, standing to rinse the bowl in the sink. The dog lifted its head, ears perking slightly at the sound of his voice. Jack paused, then smirked. "Shadow," he said, testing the name aloud. It fit. Something about the way the dog moved, the way it had appeared in the dead of night like a ghost from another life. Shadow. The dog blinked at him but didn't protest. Jack took that as acceptance. The rest of the day passed quietly. Jack split firewood out back, taking a break from the heaviness inside the cabin. The cold bit at his skin, but the familiar rhythm of work helped clear his mind. When he returned, Shadow was still lying near the fire, its breathing steady, its body no longer trembling from exhaustion. Jack sat down in his chair, stretching his legs as he sipped what was left of his coffee. The world outside was a frozen wasteland, but inside, there was warmth, life. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he had shared his space with another living thing. As night fell, Jack banked the fire and locked the door. He glanced at Shadow one last time before heading to bed, expecting to be met with the same restless silence that had filled his nights for years. But as he lay there, listening to the soft sounds of the dog breathing, he realized something had changed. The cabin didn't feel quite as empty anymore. The morning came with the soft creak of wood and the dull glow of winter light filtering through the frost-covered windows. Jack woke slowly, his body stiff from years of restless sleep and cold mornings. The air inside the cabin was heavy with the scent of burning wood. But there was another presence, a steady sound that hadn't been there before, breathing slow and rhythmic. He turned his head slightly, eyes adjusting to the dim light, and saw the German Shepherd curled near the fireplace, its chest rising and falling in deep sleep. For the first time since it had collapsed at his doorstep, the dog looked at peace, its body no longer trembling, its muscles no longer wound tight in fear. Jack exhaled, rubbing a rough hand over his face before sitting up. The cold hit him immediately, the air sharp against his skin as he swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood. He rolled his shoulders, shaking off the last remnants of sleep, then moved toward the kitchen, the worn floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The dog didn't stir, its ears twitching slightly at the sound of movement, but it didn't wake. That was a good sign. It trusted him enough to sleep through the noise, enough to rest without fear of attack. Jack poured water into a rusted kettle, setting it on the stove as he reached for the bag of coffee grounds tucked inside a cabinet. The ritual was familiar, muscle memory guiding him through each motion as he prepared his morning cup. He had never been a man of routine, not in the way most people were, but certain things had stuck with him: hot coffee, a fire in the mornings, silence before the day fully began. He leaned against the counter as he waited, his gaze drifting back toward the dog. Shadow, he reminded himself. He had given it a name, something he rarely did for anything he didn't intend to keep. The thought sat heavy in his chest. He had told himself the night before that this was temporary, that the dog would leave once it was strong enough. But now, watching the way its paws twitched in sleep, the way it stretched slightly as the heat from the fire seeped into its bones, Jack wasn't so sure. The kettle whistled, breaking the quiet, and he pulled it from the stove, pouring steaming water over the coffee grounds and inhaling the rich, bitter scent. The warmth spread through him as he took the first sip, letting it settle deep in his gut. He moved to the window, pressing a hand against the fogged glass and peering outside. The snow had stopped sometime during the night, leaving behind a pristine, untouched landscape. The sky was clear, the sun barely beginning to rise over the treetops, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. There were no tracks, no signs that anyone had come searching for the dog. Jack's fingers tapped against the rim of his mug, a slow, thoughtful rhythm. If Shadow had belonged to someone, if it had escaped from something, then surely there would be people looking for it. But the silence outside told him otherwise. The world had moved on, leaving the dog behind, just like everything else that outlived its usefulness. A rustling sound pulled him from his thoughts, and he turned to see Shadow lifting its head, ears perked slightly as it blinked groggily. Jack met its gaze, watching as the dog's muscles tensed for a brief moment before it seemed to remember where it was, before the tension melted away. "Mornin'," Jack muttered, taking another sip of coffee. Shadow didn't respond, of course, but it stretched slowly, carefully, testing its limbs. Jack took that as a good sign. "You hungry?" He reached for the tin bowl he had set aside the night before, scooping out the last of the leftover stew and placing it near the dog. Shadow sniffed it cautiously before eating, slower this time, more controlled. Jack leaned against the counter, watching. The dog was regaining its strength. Soon it would be ready to leave, ready to go back to whatever life it had before. Jack told himself that was a good thing. He had never been good at attachments, had spent too many years cutting himself off from the world, and for good reason. The more you cared, the more it hurt when things were taken from you. He had learned that lesson enough times to know better. But as he watched the dog finish its meal, as he saw the way its tail twitched slightly, almost hesitant, he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest, something he didn't want to name. The day passed in quiet, the kind of silence Jack had grown used to but now felt different with another presence in the cabin. He spent most of the morning chopping wood, stacking the fresh logs near the door while Shadow rested near the fireplace, its eyes following him every time he moved. It was watching, studying him the same way he had been studying it. By midday, the dog had finally mustered the energy to stand on all fours, its legs still unsteady but stronger than before. Jack didn't acknowledge it, didn't say anything as he continued his work, but he saw it out of the corner of his eye, testing its weight, stretching out its limbs. It would be ready to leave soon. But then the sound came, distant, low, the unmistakable hum of an engine. Jack froze, his entire body going rigid as he turned toward the window. The truck was moving slow, its tires crunching over packed snow, heading down the barely visible trail that led toward his cabin. No one came out here, not unless they had a reason. Jack set his coffee down, moving toward the fireplace and grabbing the rifle he kept leaned against the stone hearth. Shadow's ears perked, its body shifting slightly as it sensed the tension in the air. Jack didn't have to tell it to be quiet. The dog was already alert, its muscles coiled. The truck came to a stop just outside the cabin, the engine idling for a moment before the doors creaked open. Two men stepped out, their silhouettes framed against the blinding white of the snow. Jack didn't recognize them, but he didn't need to. Their posture, the way they moved, it told him everything he needed to know. One of the men stepped forward, his boots crunching against the snow as he stopped a few feet from the door. "Afternoon," he called out, his voice light, too casual. Jack didn't move from his spot near the window. "What do you want?" His voice was flat, uninterested. The man smiled, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Just looking for something," he said, his gaze flickering toward the cabin. "Or someone." Jack's grip on the rifle tightened. He didn't need to ask what they were looking for. He already knew. Shadow let out a low, nearly imperceptible growl, its body tense beside the fire. Jack exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had spent years living in peace, had left the world behind for a reason. But now, with two men standing outside his door, with a dog that had fought to survive resting at his feet, he realized something. The past had a way of finding you no matter how far you ran. And Jack had just run out of places to hide. Jack didn't move. His fingers curled tighter around the rifle, the weight of it steady in his grip. The two men outside hadn't stepped forward yet, but they weren't leaving either. They stood by the truck, their posture too casual to be natural, the kind of relaxed stance men took when they wanted to look harmless but were anything but. Jack had seen it before, in another life, long before he disappeared into these woods. He glanced at Shadow, whose body was tense, ears pricked forward, muscles coiled like a spring waiting to snap. The dog knew it too. This wasn't a friendly visit. Jack exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, forcing himself to loosen up, to look uninterested. Looking like a threat would only escalate things, and he needed to know exactly what he was dealing with before he made a move. The man closest to the truck stepped forward, just one careful step, testing the air like a predator watching for weakness. "You're a hard man to find," he said, his voice still carrying that easygoing lilt that didn't quite fit. His eyes flickered toward the cabin, toward the window where Jack stood just out of sight. "Mind if we come in?" Jack didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch between them, let the cold wind fill the space where words should be. The man's smile twitched at the edges, a flicker of something beneath the surface. Impatience. Jack had spent enough time reading men like this to know that was a good thing. Impatient men made mistakes. Finally, Jack moved. He stepped toward the door but didn't open it, just stood there, his voice even. "I mind." The man chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "Come on now, no need to be unfriendly. We're just looking for something." He paused. "Or someone." Jack let the words settle, let them weigh the air between them. He could feel Shadow's presence behind him, the steady sound of its breathing, the way the dog hadn't taken its eyes off the door. The second man, the one who hadn't spoken yet, shifted slightly. Taller than the first, leaner, the kind of build that suggested speed over strength. His eyes were colder, less interested in playing the part of a friendly visitor. Jack didn't like him. "I don't know what you're looking for," Jack said finally, keeping his voice flat. "But it's not here." The man sighed dramatically, rubbing a hand over his chin as if Jack had just personally inconvenienced him. "See, that's the thing," he said, taking another step forward. Jack felt his pulse slow, his body shifting into the readiness he hadn't needed in years. "I think maybe it is. Big dog, military markings, shouldn't be hard to miss. You haven't seen anything like that, have you?" Jack didn't blink. "No dogs here." The man smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Jack's fingers twitch against the rifle. "That's so?" His gaze flickered to the ground near the door, where a faint trail of disturbed snow led from the trees to the cabin. Tracks. Jack cursed himself for not thinking of it earlier. The second man finally spoke, his voice quieter but sharper. "You mind if we take a look around?" Jack did not move. "Ido." For the first time, the taller man smiled too, but it wasn't amusement. It was something else, something sharper. "You see," he said, tilting his head slightly, "that makes us think you've got something to hide." Jack exhaled slowly, his pulse steady. He had been here before, though in different circumstances, with different men, but the feeling was the same. The tension just before a fight, the moment where words were no longer enough but neither side had made the first move yet. He had no doubt that if he let them search, they wouldn't leave empty-handed. He also had no doubt that if he didn't let them search, things would escalate fast. Behind him, Shadow shifted, letting out the faintest growl, so low it was almost a vibration in the air. The men outside didn't hear it, but Jack did. He made his decision. "You can turn around and leave," he said, his voice just as casual as theirs had been earlier. "Or you can try to come inside. But I promise you won't like how that ends." The first man sighed, rubbing his hand over his face as if Jack were being unreasonable. But the second man's eyes stayed locked onto him, measuring. Jack didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe too deep. He knew this moment, had lived in it too many times to count. If they were going to do something, they would do it now. The first man finally shrugged, his breath coming out in a cloud of white. "Well now," he said, clicking his tongue. "Ain't that a shame?" He took a slow step back, then another, nodding toward the truck. The taller man hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before following. Jack didn't lower the rifle. Not until both men were back inside the vehicle. Not until the engine roared back to life and the truck reversed, turning slowly before heading back the way it came. Jack stayed where he was, watching until the sound of the engine faded into the wind, until the woods swallowed the trail of exhaust and the quiet returned. Only then did he let out the breath he had been holding. Shadow let out a low whine, stepping closer to his side. Jack glanced down, meeting the dog's dark eyes. "Yeah," he murmured, reaching out to scratch just behind its ear. "Me too." He turned away from the door, setting the rifle back against the wall as he moved to the window, peering out one last time. The truck was gone, but Jack knew better than to think this was over. Those men weren't the type to give up easily. They had found their way to him once. They would be back. He looked at Shadow again, at the scars along its side, the way it held itself even now, alert, waiting for the next fight. He had told himself he wouldn't get involved, that this wasn't his problem. But the moment he had opened that door and let the dog inside, that choice had been taken from him. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, already thinking through what he needed to do next. "Guess you're stuck with me now," he muttered. Shadow tilted its head, ears twitching. Jack shook his head and moved toward the fireplace, grabbing another log and tossing it onto the dwindling embers. Outside, the snow stretched quiet and endless, but Jack could feel it. The shift, the tension that hadn't been there before. Trouble was coming, and this time he wasn't sure if he could run from it. The silence in the cabin felt different now, heavy, like the weight of the inevitable pressing down on Jack's chest, settling deep into his bones. He paced slowly, his steps soundless against the wooden floor, his mind working through every possible scenario. Those men would be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. They hadn't bought his lie. Not really. They had seen the tracks, seen the way he had bristled at their questions. And men like that, men who moved with purpose, who carried themselves like wolves hunting prey, they didn't let things go. Jack had spent years avoiding the world, keeping his head down, staying away from the kind of trouble that followed men like them. But trouble had found him anyway. Or maybe he had invited it in the moment he had opened his door to the half-dead dog lying at his threshold. Shadow sat by the fire, watching him with those sharp, intelligent eyes. The dog was tense, muscles coiled, head tilted slightly as if listening for something Jack couldn't hear. Maybe it was. Shadow had been trained for this, bred for situations that required split-second reactions and precision. Even injured, even after everything, it hadn't lost that edge. Jack stopped pacing, ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. "We can't stay," he muttered. Shadow didn't react, just kept watching. Jack knew what was coming, knew that if those men returned, they wouldn't come asking questions this time. They'd come to take what they wanted, and if he stood in their way, they'd put him down like an old stubborn dog past its prime. He wasn't ready to go out like that, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let them take Shadow back to whatever hell it had escaped from. Jack moved to the small storage space at the back of the cabin, pulling open the chest he hadn't touched in years. Inside, beneath layers of dust and old regrets, lay the tools of a past he had sworn to leave behind. A weathered rucksack, a hunting knife, extra ammunition. He hesitated for only a moment before slinging the bag over his shoulder. He grabbed a canteen from the shelf, filled it with water, and reached for the old revolver tucked into the corner of the chest. He checked the chamber, spun the cylinder absently before clicking it back into place. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if one came, he'd be ready. Shadow lifted its head as Jack moved to the door. "Time to go," Jack murmured. The dog stood, shook itself off, and followed without hesitation. Outside, the cold was biting, the snow crunching beneath their steps as they moved toward the treeline. Jack kept his pace even, forcing himself to think past the adrenaline humming beneath his skin. The plan was simple: get to higher ground, find a place to hole up until he could figure out their next move. The woods were his home, his sanctuary. He knew these paths better than anyone. But those men, they were hunters too, and he had just become their prey. They moved fast, Shadow keeping pace beside him, ears twitching at every sound. Jack listened too, forcing himself to hear past the wind, past the rustling of branches weighed heavy with ice. He had spent enough time in dangerous places to recognize when he was being followed. And he wasn't surprised when the faint crunch of footsteps echoed from somewhere behind them. They weren't alone. Jack didn't stop moving. He adjusted the strap of his pack, shifting his weight, keeping his hands loose. If it came to a fight, he needed to be ready. He reached down, brushing his fingers against Shadow's fur, feeling the slow ripple of tension beneath the thick coat. The dog was ready too. Then came the voices, distant at first but closing in. "He's not far." The words were sharp, cutting through the frozen air. Jack didn't flinch. He moved faster, veering off the main path, cutting through the denser parts of the forest where the snow lay thicker, untouched. Shadow followed without question. They had minutes, maybe less, before the men caught up. Jack's mind raced, mapping out every possible option, every possible escape route. They could double back, lose them in the deeper parts of the woods. But if these men were as trained as he suspected, they'd expect that. He needed something else, something they wouldn't see coming. Then he saw it. Just ahead, a break in the trees, a ridge that dropped off into a steep, snow-covered slope. It wasn't an easy descent, but it was their best chance. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed Shadow's harness, giving the dog a quick, firm signal before pushing forward. The moment they hit the edge, Jack leapt, his body twisting as the ground gave way beneath them. The world tilted, snow rushing past in a blur as they slid down the slope, gravity pulling them fast, too fast. Shadow stayed close, moving instinctively, its body low to the ground, adjusting for the speed and angle. Jack dug his heels in, slowing just enough to keep control. The descent was rough, jarring, but when they finally hit the bottom, he was on his feet in seconds, gun in hand, eyes scanning the ridge above. The men hadn't followed. Not yet. Jack could hear them cursing, could picture them hesitating at the top, debating whether to take the risk. Good. That hesitation was all he needed. He turned to Shadow, nodding once before they moved again, slipping into the thicker part of the woods where the trees would cover their tracks. The wind howled through the branches, carrying the scent of pine and ice, masking their trail. Jack knew they weren't safe yet, but they had bought themselves time. And sometimes, time was the only advantage you needed. They ran for what felt like hours, deeper into the wilderness, away from the world that had tried to swallow them both. Eventually, when Jack was sure they had put enough distance between them and the men at the ridge, he slowed, breathing heavy, his body aching from the effort. He glanced at Shadow, who was panting but steady, eyes still sharp, still watching. "We did it," Jack murmured, more to himself than the dog. But Shadow huffed, as if answering, as if acknowledging that this was far from over. Jack let out a slow breath, looking up at the darkening sky. They couldn't go back. Not now. Maybe not ever. But as he stood there, surrounded by nothing but trees and snow and the steady presence of the dog at his side, he realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that meant he had something worth fighting for again. He reached down, ruffling the thick fur at Shadow's neck, feeling the warmth beneath his fingers. The dog leaned into him slightly, just enough to show that it understood, that it had chosen him as much as he had chosen it. Jack nodded to himself, already making plans, already thinking ahead. They had survived today. Tomorrow they would find a new path, a new way forward. Together, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of fresh snow, of possibility, of something that felt a little like freedom. Jack turned, Shadow at his heels, and walked into the wilderness, disappearing into the trees, leaving behind everything that had come before. Thank you for watching this incredible story of resilience and survival. If you enjoyed the journey of Jack and Shadow, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling tales. Your support helps us bring more captivating stories to life. Stay tuned for the next adventure. We can't wait to see you again in our upcoming stories. See you soon.